Okay, welcome everyone. This is Henry Fernandez, and I count it a privilege to have you joining me today on this podcast. It is always a blessing to see you guys. Many of you are watching or you're listening by audio. I appreciate it. Please make sure you comment as something is connecting with you and so forth. Well, I have two guests here with me today. I would just like to introduce them. First, we have Alexander Rundlet. He's an attorney. He's the chief strategist at the Social Justice Institute at Florida Memorial University. And my dear brother, Newton Shannon, president and CEO of OIC of South Florida. Gentlemen, welcome. So glad that you took the time out to be with us. Lots of people watching right now. They know who you guys are. So we're going to talk about this topic today, creating the change. Of course, we know change is necessary, especially in America, right? We need a lot of changes in all sectors of society. Let's address the social injustice and the senseless killing of African Americans in the United States of America. Now, you know, this is a very touchy topic. Some people don't want you to talk about it. Some people want you to lay low, thinking, what's the problem? And sometimes it's not, you're not sure what angle they're coming from. But as unbelievable as it may sound, some people think there is no social injustice in America. What do you say about that?
Well, Bishop, I'm happy to jump in. First of all, thank you for having the both of us. We're deeply honored to be able to communicate to you and to your audience. I think, the first reaction is you kind of smirk and recognize that certainly they're disillusioned. But I tend to take a little bit more of a nuanced approach to that. And I think there's segments and levels to it. The first thing I would say is that you have a segment of people who are overtly racists. They're unabashed about it. And they're kind of like, yes, we are. So what? And that's easy to identify that group. I think the second layer to this is a little more nuanced from a human standpoint. One of the bases of racism is about power, a transference of power. And embedded in that is a great degree of fear. And the reality is no one wants to give away power. And so historically in this country, there's a certain segment and a classification of folks, a race who've been more privileged than others. And they hold powers. They've made laws that have been convenient and expedient to their self-interests. And they have no interest and intention of relinquishing that power. And that's a part. And racism is a very complex thing, but that is a part of the nuance that I think brings people to not want to acknowledge because it's convenient. It's convenient because they will be relinquishing their own power. And so it's easy and convenient for them to not acknowledge. And it makes them reflect on their own selves and their own demons, so to speak. And so it's just convenient for them not to want to acknowledge that racism exists.
Okay. Alexander.
Yes, and I just want to thank you, Bishop Fernandez, and my colleague, Mr. Shannon, to be able to speak with you about these topics and for all the listeners for this really important discussion. I'll echo everything my colleague just said. Just on a broader view, I think, the concept or the thinking that there's no social injustice, it's an attitude that really just ignores reality and facts. And my colleague presented some reason in terms of the power as to why some people may be inclined to ignore reality and facts. But, when you consider the glaring disparities between Black people, for instance, and white people in wealth accumulation, health, longevity, educational opportunity, employment, et cetera, the only conclusion one can draw is that social injustice remains among the central challenges for the continued viability of our society. So that's the broader view. I think we're going to address some more particular aspects of the question, but my colleague indicated that power is one of the main reasons why that reality is ignored, but there are other factors that go into it in terms of our political and social context and the current cultural dialogue. So I'll just move on. I know we have other questions to address.
No problem. And I totally agree with both of you that, it's an illusion to think that, social injustice, racism doesn't exist. It's just, sometimes I watch television and I listen to these people doing interviews or even social media, and it makes you wonder, what planet are these people from? Are they mentally okay? Just some of the comments they make. Now, with that being said, because we all can agree that there is a problem, is it safe to say that the problem is still here because hundreds of years ago, that there were some systems that were put in place that America has not dealt with? And I believe where there's darkness, where there's injustice, the God that we serve, there's always going to be an unsettling of man's spirit, because we were not created to be oppressed. So I think what I just need to know, do you feel that there are laws or systems that were put in place to perpetuate this kind of a culture of racism and social injustice? And then, if so, two-part question, if so, how do we eradicate it? How do we deal with it?
If I could go first on this, I think, I think, as we just addressed in your first question, first, I think, it's necessary for our country to acknowledge really that our context is infected with widespread inequality that has its roots in racial oppression. Our country started out as a racist society. And by acknowledging that history, it includes acknowledging the role that white supremacy played and continues to play in our social context. And that's important. And I think it's also further important to recognize that when we discuss white supremacy, we are no longer only speaking of hoods and robes, rebel yells and swastikas, but we're talking about the cultural norms and laws, which I think gets to your question, Bishop Fernandez, that place whiteness at the center of any discussion. It puts whiteness at the head of the line for resources. It makes whiteness as the default or neutral perspective. And the consequence is that every color and every other ethnicity is disadvantaged and devalued. And conjoined with this is the concept, which has particular power in the American context, is the notion of anti-Blackness. And we have in America, because of the nature of how our society was constructed as a slave society, we have a black-white dichotomy, which makes Blackness as the opposite of whiteness, which in our cultural and political context over history has made, white is equivalent to smart and industrious.
Yes.
And Black becomes the equivalent of dumb and lazy. And whiteness is law-abiding and Blackness is criminal. And whiteness is kind and Blackness is not. Whiteness is moral, Blackness is immoral, amoral. So these cultural notions were conceived in the beginning of our country and persist today in our cultural context. These conjoined concepts, the philosophies of whiteness, white supremacy, and anti-Blackness, they really infect our politics and our culture, and we need to acknowledge it and address it. And I just want to go on for a few more points. Hold on. We need to also understand that the concept of racism as we find it today has to be understood a little bit differently. Usually we understand racism as an intentional act by an immoral or amoral person. And in our current context, we need to shift our focus from racism to the conditions. Rather than the perpetrator perspective, we need to shift our perspective to the conditions. And those conditions reflect, as we discussed earlier, wide disparities in these critical areas of our society: health, education, educational opportunities, et cetera. And the existence of these disparities provide the evidence of ongoing racist effects and persistent policy choices. So we should think of racism, structural racism, which we're more and more in the habit, thankfully, of saying it's not an accusation per se. It is an adjective to describe our current society and to incentivize the elimination of the policies that maintain persistent racism. And then just in terms of your second question, how do we address and move forward? I want to add that to facilitate the dialogue to address these challenges, I think we really need to confront the concept of quote unquote color blindness
Right.
within our legal and political and cultural dialogue. And in our mind, the concept of color blindness is as destructive as the concept, as the 3/5 of a person concept from the Dred Scott decision by the United States Supreme Court in the 19th century. And its persistence, this notion that we have a colorblind society and we cannot consider race or ethnicity in our laws or norms or discussion, it provides an excuse and a permission structure to continue to refuse to address head on these concepts we discussed earlier, white supremacy and anti-Blackness, and the continued refusal to confront these destructive ideologies permits racism and social injustice to continue. So that's my, broad-based response to your question. So I'm sorry to take up so much time.
No, that's fine. I think what you said was perfect, needed to be said, and I think the audience is getting, I think a full scope of what the root cause is, and you so eloquently explained that. So, Newton, what's your input on this? And then I have a follow-up question.
Sure. No, I got to tell you, if I may call you Alexander, man, my brother, those were some phenomenal points, and we're aligned in thinking. I want to specifically tease out the piece where you talk about going from seeing this as a moral, egregious act to thinking and focusing on the conditions. I think that is extremely important, because otherwise you just have two people shouting at each other when you just shout racist, racist, racist. And whether it's true, right, or indifferent, just the natural human experience, you're going to bring the persons to a defensive posture. And it gets us from just shouting the word racism to contextualizing what it is, so that the broader ecosystem, non-whites, non-Blacks, and non-minorities, for them to be able to listen, accept, digest, and we can begin to collectively go on this journey of quote unquote healing. That's extremely important. In fact, one of the, I believe the Black Lives Matter movement is one that was necessary because we needed a bit of an agitation of what was going on. But one of my, light critiques of the movement is that there isn't a clear-cut solution and strategy that we've all coalesced around to begin to make progress. Sure. It's just the agitation. And I think that's important, to blow the whistle, so to speak. But I think there is a negative consequence, because now you just have people who are being offended versus being able to understand, even those who may not be overtly racist, for them to begin to come to a level of introspection when you point out the conditions that begin to make you say, well, that's what you mean. And then they become to a place for introspection and then hopefully healing. I want to just quickly pivot to the solution part that ties into that. I think it's imperative, Bishop Alexander and the community, that we begin to shift in that direction, because otherwise we're just going to be throwing stones at each other for a very long time to come. But I especially, Bishop, think it's important for young people. I get concerned because particularly young people, middle school, high schools, et cetera, they may not necessarily always have the depth of understanding. My concern about it is, in some respects, if we're not careful with our messaging and talking about the conditions, the context, and even solutions to these things, what it does to young people where it becomes almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because all it is this narrative is Blacks are this, Blacks aren't that. And then the images unintentionally, in some respects, and our intent to demonstrate how bad it is, we don't counter that with solutions and images that give young Black youth, minority youth, Black and brown, Hispanic youth, and otherwise, another image of themselves. So I think it's important to contextualize, show the conditions, so that people can begin to have a healthy dialogue. And then secondarily, with our narrative about exposing people to the issues of racism, we have to be able to counter that with positive images, particularly for our young people, so they see a different way forward.
Okay, so the follow-up question is, we've diagnosed the problem. We know there's a root cause. There's a history of systems put in place to again, perpetuate this lie and this oppression on people. So we know it's there. And as you said, Newton, you're concerned about this current society, and in particular the young people, when it comes to the message that they're receiving and how they relate to it and so forth. The question then is, who should take the charge in steering this conversation in the right direction? Is it a community of people? And if so, who are these people? Because you're not going to change anything if you don't confront it. Don't expect something to change if you're not willing to confront it. So how do we, because like you said, Newton, we just can't keep talking and just keep repeating ourselves. What is going to create the change for the younger generation to identify that, hey, here's proof. There's systems that were put in place to oppress us, to oppress a certain group of people, Black and brown people. However, here's the right way, because we're getting older, we're going to die. And to keep this fight going, these are the things you need to do. Who's responsible for doing those things?
Well, I think I like the fact that my colleague is a strategist, and I suspect that when he's sizing up strategy, he has to think about all the stakeholders, how they contribute to said issue and or opportunity, to size up how he will begin his stakeholder engagement, to be able to have people develop consensus that there is in fact an issue, and incrementally work on strategies of which each of the stakeholders have their respective roles to play in it, right? And so if you think about racism from that standpoint, to lean into your question, we have to dissect the various segments that lean into and or have the greatest impact to revert racism. So just globally speaking, I think you're doing it now. You are a man of faith. You convene people from a nurturing and healing, largely in part from a faith standpoint. So there is a sub cohort of folks within the context of your leadership and your platform to be able to create that. And I think that's true for every segment of the community. Then if you think about the different segments that impact racism, there is the policy lens that has material implication because they're systemic.
Yes.
So who are the policy makers that begin to systemically really deconstruct the constructed systems that are counterintuitive and not leaning towards brown and Black folks? And so from a policy standpoint, I think all the policy makers, elected officials, have a responsibility, and then let's call it opportunity, to lean in that regard. There is the business community, which I've been impressed with, who've incrementally stepped up more and more, because the right, wrong, or indifferent, the people with the money, the business community tends to have a lot of influence, right? The faith group, et cetera, et cetera. So I step back to say that we need a comprehensive strategy. I think it's the policymakers, it's the influencers, it's the business community. We all have to come together in doing it. But I'll tell you once again, as we talked about in the previous question, that we have to start and just take a half a step back. The issues of racism can be emotional. They could be stressful. They are absolutely traumatic. But I think we got to get to that adjective Alexander talked about when we talk about the conditions, because once you see the conditions, you begin to reflect, internalize, and recognize there's a problem. Beyond that, you have a shouting match.
Wow. So true. Alexander?
Yeah, I fully agree with everything my colleague said. I'd like to add to that. I think it amplifies what he said. In response to your question, Bishop, who's responsible? And I point to a recent book by the author. Her name is Heather McGhee, and the name of the book is called The Sum of Us. And that book makes the case that our political and social culture has framed civil rights and equality as a zero-sum game. And that means that there's the long-held view that if Black people, for instance, obtain a greater measure of equality or fuller realization of civil, social, political, and economic rights, that white people would necessarily lose. And the shift in thinking must be that this is not the case and it shouldn't be the case. Mm. And we should rather imagine that our well-being and destiny as a society, white people, Black people, brown people, they're interconnected and interdependent, and that an increase in equality and justice for one group is of benefit for us all. So the overarching transition that we need to make is that the mindset away from the quote unquote zero-sum game, that if one segment or cohort of the population gains, that another must necessarily lose. Mm-hmm. So to shift to the mindset that that if one group of people is going to gain, we all gain. Mm-hmm. And that, as an analogy, not that, I get a bigger piece of the pie and your piece of the pie is smaller, but mm-hmm. that we just have a bigger pie.
Right.
So that's one thing. Just moving back to kind of the nuts and bolts of what my colleague said, we have a lot of activists and in the post-George Floyd movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, and there's a lot of, social and moral outrage about inequality as manifested by the George Floyd incident. And it's incumbent upon policymakers, strategists like myself, think tanks to harness that energy. I think we have that energy has been seen by a greater proportion of the population to see that this is an issue that should be addressed. And now, for instance, you can see the concepts of white supremacy, discussed on CNN or on your nightly news. And so that's a good thing. It comes now for policymakers to identify the policies that have persisted over time that either create, exacerbate, or maintain these disparities or the conditions that we've talked about. And I think that's a dialogue that's going forward is going to hopefully increase. The final thing I'll say on this point is that we're in an era, and I think it takes greater attention for policymakers to focus in on, is that we're no longer in an era where you're going to have overt, blatantly discriminatory laws that say Black people can't do X or Latin people can't do Y or white people can only do X. And so it's more important for our policymakers to be more astute to identify, I think, what are referred to kind of proxy discrimination markers, where Blackness is equivalent, in the social and political context is the equivalent of something else, which is you can legally discriminate against. And one of the greatest examples of that in our current society is, of mass incarceration, the whole issue of mass incarceration. There's a wonderful book, it's almost a decade old, called The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. And it speaks about how the war on drugs has disproportionately and destructively affected Black and brown people because of the focus of law enforcement resources in, Black and brown communities, resulting in arrests, detention, conviction, sentencing, and the more politically damaging consequence that Black and brown people have been labeled as felons, can't vote, can't participate in jury service, are disqualified from economic participation for licensing and things like that. And those are things like that type of proxy discrimination issue is something that should be addressed. So I'll stop it there, but I think, I agree with everything my colleague has said.
Yeah, well said. And since you brought up the issue of policing and policy, let's go there, because this seems to be the issue that's dominating the media now in our country, policing, the practices of these different police agencies in different states. I don't think anybody, especially, and again, going back to what you guys have said earlier, I think it was Newton who said it, until you have to see the other side of it. Whites have to see and understand when we cry out racism and inequality and so forth, what do we really mean? Because when you look at how police agencies around the country would do a traffic stop to a white person versus a Black person or brown person, and they'll brag that they follow policy and procedures. Well, the response to the two different scenarios are different. So either there's two different policies for white people and black and brown people, or somebody's violating the policy. And by that, I mean, for example, you see the traffic stop. I have seen it where a police officer will stop a Caucasian person and that person will be disrespectful, do all kinds of stuff. And it's like the police, they have patience. Nothing is said, nothing is done. In some cases, they walk away. But for a black person, I think in most cases, and they'll be quick to throw the thing, well, the black person was doing this. No, so was the white. Just look at the video. The problem is the approach to the black and brown person was so aggressive and uncalled for. And of course, it escalated the issue. Like, I can give you my own personal experience. Years ago in my city, I was taking my children to school. They were was 4 and 2 at the time. And I was late because I had to go somewhere, so I was late. So I turned that corner, I made the right turn, and I knew I was speeding. So here comes this guy on the bike, this police officer. He jumped out of the bushes. I mean, scared me, and just in aggressive way, pointed, go that way. And okay, I pulled over. This white police officer, who is still on the force today, pulled up to my window, already's got his hand on his gun. Boy, give me your license and registration. Look, when another human being, and especially knowing the history, that's why I said from the beginning, the history of how this country was built on, to have a white police officer approach a black person, that is inappropriate. What book, what training has taught police officers to say that? Now, I had to look and I watched my kids terrified in the back. And perhaps if they weren't in the back, I might have responded in a way to aggravate that officer, then to do something different. Anyway, he wrote the ticket, went back to his bike and his motorcycle, wrote the ticket, and it gets worse. Came right to my window and threw the ticket in my face and walk away. So I really want to ask you both, because I'm speaking on behalf of a lot of mothers and fathers. I have 2 boys. Every day I have to talk to my boys. If you get stopped, do this. So the question then is, how do you explain, and perhaps, Alexander, you want to start off. One is maybe a 2-part question. How can we fix this bad police practices that we're seeing in our country? And then 2, what do we say to our children? How do you give parents advice to say to your children, you're going to be violated, but I want you to come home alive?
Right. Well, for the first point, in terms of policing, and I know my colleague has other insights, I'll say that I think it's important to take into account the critique, the larger society critique, such as yours, Bishop Fernandez, about these negative interactions that many of us have had with police. And I think it's important to empower the good police officers, quote unquote, that constitute a vast majority of the police departments out there, is to empower them to make the corrections that they need to bring policing to the level of respect and professionalism that all of us agree. So I think that's really important. And part of it has to do with empowering police chiefs and municipalities to discipline poor officers, to refuse to continue to employ poor officers, to make police more accountable by eliminating a lot of the laws and norms that make policing largely unaccountable to civil society. And there's also training about anti-racism training and sensitivity training and things like that need to be done. Those are kind of broad stroke issues, and many of those issues are being addressed in some of the legislation that's proposed on a state level, on a national level. There are more robust citizen investigation panels, such as in Broward and Miami-Dade just passed one, but those are measures that increase police accountability. And the thinking is that if there's more accountability, there'll be more responsive actions to improve behavior. That's kind of generally speaking. In terms of, the points of how do you counsel, how does a mother or father counsel their children about policing interactions? I mean, there's unfortunately, there's been a list of 10 points of how to interact with police. It's been circulating for decades for how do we counsel our young boys and girls to survive, which is a hard way of saying it, an interaction with police. And I can give you those quickly, and then we can discuss those. And they're fairly simple and straightforward. And again, it's like one is, be polite, respectful when stopped by the police and keep your mouth closed. 2, remember that your goal is to get home safely. And if you feel that your rights have been violated, you and your parents have the right to file a formal complaint with your local jurisdiction, and your lawyer, if there are charges to be brought, can challenge that conduct that may have violated your rights in court. 3, don't under any circumstance get into an argument with the police. It's not worth it, and it's probably not going to do anything. 4, always remember that anything you say or do can be used against you. We've all heard that in terms of watching TV and police advising folks of their rights. 5, this is very important, is to keep your hands in plain sight, out of your pockets, on the steering wheel. Just make sure the police can see your hands at all times, and that just gives fewer justifications or pretexts in case there's some unprovoked or unwarranted police activity. 6, of course, always avoid any physical contact with the police. You should not make any sudden movements. Again, keep your hands in plain view and out of your pockets. 7, you should never run from the police, even if you're afraid or you believe that the stop is unjustified. 8, even if you believe you're innocent, you shouldn't resist arrest. I mean, police are trying to do their job. I mean, they're acting on, at least in their mind, what they believe is reasonable, and we can go and the motivations and facts that underlie the police action is for evaluation a later time. 9, you shouldn't make any statements about the incident until you're able to meet with a lawyer. I think that's pretty clear. You can certainly identify yourself and always be respectful and answer basic questions, but when it comes to the substance, you do have a choice to say, I don't wish to speak to you, and answer a question until I speak to a lawyer. And then 10, the final thing is just stay calm to the extent you can, and remain under control. And you should watch your body language, emotions, and words. Those are the general. That's the general advice that we give to kids and people to interact with the police, and they fit everybody. And the final point I should make, which is a broader issue, is that many of us think we have constitutional rights that I can't be stopped, or I can't be arrested, or I can't be questioned. And that's true, but many people don't realize that those rights are not self-executing. They don't pop into efficacy once you say them. Like you tell the police, like, you can't do this to me, and all of a sudden an officer will stop. All of our rights are for enforcement. All of our rights are for enforcement after the fact. All of them. So if something happens that doesn't match the standard, or doesn't match the Constitution, it's not going to take care of itself during the interaction. It's going to take care of itself either, in court, by the prosecutor, by the lawyer, by the judge. So that realization, I think, goes a long way to help improve behavior. That in terms of argumentation or confrontation, that all those things they're going to be enforced by a judge. So my colleague, I know you from a law enforcement perspective, you can let me know whether amend or
right and
some of that advice, but I think that's pretty standard advice in terms of interactions with people.
Newton, let me ask you this. Alexander, as an attorney, and I'll get to him to say what kind of a practice he is involved in, and area of his specialty and so forth. But all of the 10 things he listed, I'm sitting there listening to him as an attorney, and I'm saying, but we do these things. I don't know if you were thinking like that. I'm sitting back. Okay, we're polite, we're nice, we're good. And even with that, I guess the first question, and I know I'm speaking on behalf of a lot of people, they're probably making comments now. Why do we have to be so right about everything and walk the chalk line, while other races get away with the same stuff that we do. I just don't get that. So help me here, Brother Newton.
I got you. I hear and feel your angst and that of many of us. And I suspect my colleague, Brother Alexander, agrees with you. And he offers a pragmatic and legitimate approach. But we know life doesn't always work like that. Mm-hmm. And the reality is, I think of some of these issues like a very difficult paint job. You start with your primer, but the job isn't done. You put one layer on, the job still isn't done. You got to put another layer on and another layer on before you finally get that product. I tend to be one that's big on momentum. I'm a hopeless optimistic. I start by acknowledging the progress we've made because, quite frankly, maybe therapeutic, you need that, right? You got to feel like something is getting better, right? And it also gives you momentum to lean on to continue to make progress. Specifically, I got to tell you, probably one of the most historical moments in our country, and I mean that not as an exaggerative manner, when we watched the George Floyd case and we saw the chief police, the chief of that department, and the officer's supervisor openly say, no, he was wrong. Mm-hmm. My folks, that was huge. That was bigger than big to me because, quite frankly, that also is what agitates me is that I think law enforcement officers, good ones, and I'll qualify that in just a second, they ought to be more upset than we are. Mm-hmm. Because the truth of the matter is, if we're honest with ourselves, you get 10 of your family members and they're going to be one crazy one, right? I mean, that's just true. Right? And Bishop, you as a man of faith, I'm sure whether it's our staff, whether it's our congregation,
don't go there. I got a few crazy ones.
Yes, don't we all? And so people are people. And so, but, I go back to my colleagues' responses and I support the 100%. But it's difficult, right? It's a sequence of continued attempts to continue to break down these walls piece by piece to really revert our systems. I'm very honored to have recently been appointed to, I think my colleague referenced it, the Broward County's Police and Criminal Justice Review Board. I can't wait to get started. It's a 24 board member made up.
Great. Congratulations.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to be calling you, by the way, and I mean that. It's a board made up of members of the various bar associations from various ethnic groups, et cetera, et cetera. And the first thing I said is, look, it was announced, et cetera. The first thing I wanted to do to come out is to say, let's put the gloves down, right? Because I think that's where the rhetoric is now. It's us against them, us against them, us against them. And, like I say to my executive team all the time, it may not be your fault, but it'll be your problem. So I think we're justified in our anguish and our anger, et cetera, et cetera. But at some point in time, and my mother used to say this all the time, you want to be right or you want to be effective. We're justified in our anger and our frustration. But at some point in time, we got to pivot to strategy because our lives literally depend on it. And the strategy has to be one that's comprehensive. It has to be one that includes all stakeholders because the consequence of life is too grave to do it otherwise, because we've marched and that's had a great degree of benefit. We've done a lot of other things. This season requires something different. So let's measure, take account for all the progression that's been made because it leans into momentum. And I think it's condescending to some to not acknowledge that. Let's build on it. But I think to then put a bow on your question, Bishop, is I really can't wait to engage law enforcement. Those like that chief that said he was wrong. I think I'm going to hope to use that as momentum to talk to law enforcement to say, look, I suspect you good cops have been just as frustrated. I have to believe that. And I suspect perhaps you've wanted to speak out, but the culture didn't necessarily support that because you'd be seen as a traitor, et cetera. We'd like to come alongside you to give you a voice to speak out because again, your reputation is being ruined just as well. And by the way, we need you to help root out some of these bad cops because it's in the best interest in it for everybody.
Right. Okay. And then just add to that, if I can, there is a movement, there's here in Florida, we have the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, which severely restricts municipalities and police departments' ability to deal with bad officers. Then you have the power of policing unions, which, they negotiate union disciplinary rules, which really hamstrings chiefs of police and municipal governments from disciplining officers. And those, more attention, a greater attention has been drawn to these hurdles. And hopefully we can get some momentum to reform those or, reduce or eliminate those requirements so that we can empower the good and well-meaning officers to deal with officer misconduct. And then that fuel issue also of qualified immunity, which we've discussed, which is basically civil immunity for lawsuits against police officers. By just eliminating that, again, it's creating greater incentives for accountability. And to the extent there's no accountability or like the civil liability accountability option has been taken off the table by qualified immunity. If we can make that another, threat for accountability, then that the hope is will improve behavior.
Okay, well, we're almost out of time. Let me start with you, Alexander. Just walk the audience through, what's your area of specialty in law and what do you do? And maybe just use it as a pitch to just promote, what your passions are.
Well, my background is I'm a practicing lawyer right now. My background is in indigent defense and criminal legal reform. I was a fellow from the Open Societies Foundation, which is a George Soros funded institute. I basically helped create with a collaboration of lawyers and judges in Georgia to create a revised state-funded public defender system in Georgia. I was a state public defender here in Miami for a number of years. I just have a policy background in terms of addressing criminal legal reform and addressing racial justice and racial injustice. My own private practice, I've engaged in years of civil litigation against police officers, against correctional officers, trying to vindicate constitutional rights such as the denial of medical care for arrestees and detainees or prisoners in the correctional context. Also excessive force, wrongful death, and wrongful arrest in the police context. So I've got a broad background in terms of policing, in terms of how they interact in the criminal context and the civil context, and then just over decades of experience in terms of addressing racial inequality and the structures that persist in our law. And now, again, I'm the chief strategist for the Social Justice Institute. It was created by my colleague. She's a Florida historian. She wrote a history of lynching and democracy in Florida. Dr. Tamika Hobbs, she's the founding director of the Social Justice Institute. And our focus is to address civic engagement, address gun violence, criminal legal reform, health justice, environmental justice, economic justice at our think tank here at Florida Memorial University.
Okay. I'll tell you what, we've got the perfect person on this platform today to deal with this subject. Your voice matter, Alexander, and I thank you so much for your input. Many of you are watching right now, you're listening, and I'm quite sure you've got tons of questions. I wish they could see the questions, so that they could respond to it. But Alexander, if someone wants to reach out to you, because like a father, I'm quite sure parents are dealing with their kids, telling them some horror stories about the cops and so forth. If someone wanted to get in touch with you, with your private practice and so forth, what's the information? Can you just go ahead and call it out and they'll write it down?
Unfortunately, I'm no longer in private practice.
You're no longer. Okay.
Cases and representing. I can certainly refer people to institutions. I'll be frank that it's the law is so constricted.
Right. Okay. All right. No problem. So
unfavorable. It's very hard to pursue civil actions against police officers and correctional officers. The good thing for vindication is post George Floyd, as my colleague said, we've created civilian review panels, both in Broward and Miami-Dade County. So that's probably going to be the the first layer of response to address misconduct.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for the correction. I thought you were still in private practice.
Yeah.
All right. So, Brother Newton, you're the president of and CEO of OIC of South Florida. I've worked with you before. You actually spoke at our graduation, the University of Fort Lauderdale's graduation before. Tell us, what is OIC and what role do you play? What's the purpose of this organization?
Joe, thank you so much for having me. And it was such a pleasure to be your keynote speaker for your graduation. It was a great sight to see those students cross the stage. OIC was established in 1964 by the late civil rights pioneer, Reverend Leon Sullivan. He really specifically felt that community-based organizations contribute in so many different ways, but economic prosperity is one of the ways he thinks has the greatest return, specifically getting people training in jobs. And in the 60s, he recognized that so many African Americans were not afforded opportunities for jobs, got together with 400 ministers, boycotted businesses, and they quickly said, goodness, we better listen because these guys hit us in the pockets. Recognized people didn't have the skills. So he always believed and would say aspiration without preparation leads to frustration. So we're keenly looking on making sure that there's not disparity in economic opportunity and economic mobility, but we're equally as vigilant about making sure people have the skill to be prepared to compete. So when people like us agitate and make sure, say our people need opportunity, we want to make sure they come to the table prepared. We serve 7,000 young people between Dade and Broward County, helping them answer that age-old question, what do you want to be when you grow up? So all kinds of programs to expose young people to their innate talents and abilities to align purpose, passion, and profession, not to mention certainly entrepreneurship as well. And on our adult side, we serve about 3,700 adults a year. We're licensed with the Florida Department of Education as a vocational training institute. So people could come to us and get trained and most importantly, get a job. So if you need employment, please reach out to us. We'll be happy to serve you as best we can.
Okay. Well, gentlemen, this was very informative. And I think our audience was blessed by it. If, again, you were blessed by the information given, I would love to hear from you. Make your comments. If you're watching on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, or the internet, I really appreciate it. Gentlemen, thank you so much again. I know we just ran out of time. Wish we had more time because there's so much to discuss when it comes to this topic, but you've added value to the discussion today. Again, thank you. And thanks, everybody. God bless.
God bless. Thank you, Bishop. We appreciate you as well.
Great.